All right, everybody, and welcome back to the Progressives Abroad podcast. This is your host, BoTik. I apologize in advance for any sound quality issues. I am recording live from the road right now. By the road, I mean the bicycle road. Currently somewhere in the north of Norway, and taking a very COVID-friendly bike ride in the wilderness of the north. The numbers are quite low here. I wish I could say the same about my home state of Florida. And, well, let's work on it. But today on the show, got a bit of a summertime series. Got my cousin Dan on. You may remember him from previous episodes in the beginning of the podcast. Dan's living in Colombia. He's studying and researching down there. He'll tell us more about it in a minute. And today we're going to talk about home, the concept of home, the idea of national identity, or maybe the lack thereof, and what does it mean. And we're going to talk about what it's like to live in other places and feel like home, or perhaps placeless-ness from our own experiences. So I hope you enjoy, and thanks for tuning in again to this episode of the Progressives Abroad podcast. And without further ado, Dan, thanks for coming back on the show.
Yeah, no, so pretty good. Just working, teach English online at the moment. And yeah, I'm a grad student. I study social conflict and peacemaking. Specifically, my research is related to education and immigration and language. As in, like, in the United States, specifically Spanish speakers who participate in U.S. public schools, but don't necessarily receive the same results as their English-speaking peers. And so kind of just it's a widely researched category, so nothing new or special about it, but just kind of getting further into it about it as it relates to educational practices and whatnot. Yeah, so thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, we were talking the other day, and we're always having some interesting conversations off the record. So we thought we'd bring some of that over here, because I think we were discussing a bit about, of course, what we talk a lot about on this podcast, which is, what it's like to, live abroad or live outside of, your home country. What does that mean? And then we started talking a bit about, what does this idea of home even really mean? Because, there are a lot of different interpretations of that. And so we were just kind of dissecting that. So I think, because I think home is definitely something that has a lot of different meanings for a lot of different people. And definitely if you're living abroad or living away from, maybe you've just moved around a lot in your life. We don't even have to really it's just make it for people living abroad, but maybe you've just moved around a lot. And then of course for people that don't have homes in a very realistic sense, this means a totally different thing. So yeah, let's just talk a little bit about that. Maybe we should kick it off with just some of our background. Where do you see home in your background?
Yeah, well, first I think it's important that we recognize that our family comes from a position of privilege due to being of European descent. And, also, even being of European descent in the United States has a specific, privilege given to it that many of other people in the United States and around the world do not give and are not afforded. And, our family also has not, at least in our generation, has not, always been pertained to the middle class. And so we haven't really, our parents, for the most part, have always had jobs and always had income. And, we were able to go to good public schools, and we were able to get university education. So there's definitely, we are speaking about this from people who have been granted lots of privileges that a lot of people in the world have not been granted. So I think it's important to recognize that when we're talking about, this idea of home. But the idea of home, I think, is pretty interesting because, you live in Norway and I live in Colombia in South America. And, well, Norway, I mean, you can talk about it a little bit more later, but, Colombia is also a colonized country, just as the United States is. It's a product of European colonization and the African diaspora, just as the United States is. But it's a little bit different here because, it hasn't received the same level of, modern or like 20th century and 19th century migration that the United States has. So a lot of the people here have been, pretty deeply rooted in the country, at least. I mean, there's much larger indigenous communities percentage wise than in the United States. And and then also like many of the African descendants who are here are, product of the diaspora during the times of slavery, and not, they're not like coming to the United States during waves of migration that have happened more frequently in the last, 50 or 100 years from Africa. So most of the people here have been here for, 300 to 400 years if they're from Europe or Africa, or forever if they're indigenous or native. And so, the idea of like, you can see here that the people are very connected to this land, and they feel very, people have always lived here. They've always lived in the same city, or always lived in the same town, or always lived in the same region. So they feel a very strong sense of connection to the land, and they feel pride, and they feel a sense of belonging to this country, or to this land. And so I think that's something interesting, and you probably experienced that too in Norway, considering that most people in Norway have, been in Norway forever. But it's different in the United States, at least for, many European Americans, because, we've had different waves of migration from Europe. And, specifically with in the town I grew up in Massachusetts, suburban Massachusetts, many of the, white people or the European people in the town were part of, some of the original waves of colonization that came from Europe, from England and Ireland, and primarily England and Ireland. And so, people in my town, a lot of them, like there's a girl I went to school with, she can directly trace her ancestors back to the Mayflower, so she's been, obviously her family's been like in this part of Eastern Massachusetts, for 400 years now, which is pretty remarkable. And so I think in my situation, I've never really felt like that because, our family came to the United States in the 20th century, like the beginning of the 20th century. And so, Eastern Massachusetts to me is my home, put that in quotes, my home. But, it's kind of weird to meeting other people who have lived in places, for a very long time. It seems very, very strange, to think about for me personally, because it's my home, but I really, think about it as like, well, where is my family actually from? Because my family's not from here. And even like my great grandparents or my great great grandparents aren't from here. And so it's like, what, this idea of, I don't really feel the same connection to the land that I think maybe other people do. And I don't know, maybe most people don't even think about it, especially in the United States. But I definitely think it's impacted my maybe desire or habit of moving around and finding different places, because I've never felt, this strong connection to being in a place that I call home. So we can get a little bit more into it later, but what about in Norway? How do you feel about living in Norway? And also, being from the same family, but you're from a different part of the United States.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is very it's this whole idea of, you know, home. I'm not even sure, what the more we think about it, I'm not sure what it means, but it is that feeling of maybe some place, yeah, where you have some history, some roots and stuff like that, metaphorically speaking. And yeah, I mean, but it's something that I just thought about so much throughout my life. Even growing up in Florida, I don't know what it was, but I always had this kind of feeling of, there's part of me that's of this place, and there's part of me that's not of this place. Like, I just innately had that feeling since I was a little kid. And I mean, when I was a little kid, I used to even think that I was maybe an alien or something like this, like sent from some different, planet. That was probably just me as a kid trying to like process this feeling of, using my imagination to process this feeling of, kind of let's say like placeless-ness. Or but yeah, I mean, of course I moved around a lot since then, and since Norway, I mean, I've traveled a lot around the world and lived, I would say, some substantial chunks of time in Asia and like a variety of countries throughout Europe, and like kind of had lives and had homes in these different, like, kind of momentary homes, like, let's say, like a place to live with some, a couch and a coffee boiler or whatever, so, these kinds of creature comforts of a physical home. And of course you build friendships and relationships, and then and then eventually you move on again. So it's that whole moving around, um which I've kind of like also written a lot about in like my music and like poetry and stuff like that. It kind of makes, in many ways, I use like the metaphor of kind of like the modern day, like, hobo. Like, if we think about the great American hobo, cruising on trains, hopping on trains from place to place. It's kind of the society that we live in now, where definitely, like, as you said, coming from a position like our family, and this position of kind of privilege, the world can be engineered like that, where you don't even need to stay in one place anymore. So it really conjures up a lot of these kind of new ideas of what it means to have a home, or what is, the frailty of this idea of home. Actually, it's like kind of like the good old what was his name? Joe Dirt. He said, "Home is where you make it." Home is where you make it.
Yeah.
And that's true to a certain extent, but on a larger scale, yeah. So how that looks here in Norway is very interesting, because, in Norway, you have a society, a history, a people, a large percentage of people have been here for a very long time. I mean, we have, of course, up in the north, we have indigenous people, the Sami people, who have been here. I think I'm not so well educated in the history of the Sami, but I know they've been here for at least 5,000 years. Living up in the north, and that's more of a regional thing, because they also live in the north of Norway, the north of Finland, parts of Russia and Sweden, all over there. And a lot of that history can be traced all the way from Asia, like coming over the land bridge, maybe over a period of 15,000 years. So there's people that have been here for a long time now. A lot of the people, but that's kind of more of a minority group here in Norway. But the vast majority of people that you see here, yeah, they've been here for a long time. They can trace back their family history, hundreds and hundreds, maybe 1,000 years. A lot of these people, they are directly related to Vikings, that we know here in Norway, and that's a whole other story, which we can get into, the Vikings, later. But for the most part, everybody that lives in Scandinavia, generally has circulated around Scandinavia. The place has been, okay, at some point in time was part of the Kingdom of Denmark. At some point in time it was part of Sweden. It used to be Norway. Now it's Norway again. But in general, it's kind of been in this region. you know, with the whole entire region has a population of like no more than like 15 million people. So it's about less than the population of my home state, the state of Florida. And but what's interesting to me, what's most fascinating about this is that what you see nowadays, especially there's always been a lot of trade here in Oslo, and in Norway, because of its, you know, proximity, the whole place, you know, a large, you know, it's got the longest coastline in all of Europe. It's got tons of ports and tons of sea access. So there's been lots of trade going on and a lot of people coming back and forth. So in many ways, especially here in Oslo where I live, there is this kind of long-standing history of let's say like transient workers of all sorts, like coming in, coming out of the port, setting up camp here, leaving on boats, staying for a while, leaving again. So there's this kind of transient like seafaring history here in Norway. And so it has not always been just like a kind of like stereotypical like only Scandinavians here, but they still have been the majority. But nowadays here in Norway, we have, I think in the entire country, we have about a 15% like first generation migrant population, and in Oslo it's getting near 30% now. So we do actually have quite a large population of people from all around the world here who have come here for like various reasons, which we can break down into. So in that respect, in some ways it has these like feelings of my own story, because, you know, I've moved around a lot, lived around a lot of different people coming from South Florida, also like a very diverse place in many ways, with like lots of different, you know, cultures and languages and all that. So in some ways there is like some remnants of that home feeling here, but in some ways I feel like a total alien. So yeah, but that's just my ramblings about what it feels like to be kind of at home here.
Well, yeah, so I think it's interesting to think about, and also, you know, for me, I think this is, you know, as a kid, you know, I think as a kid, because where I grew up, you know, a lot of people are Irish, and our family has, you know, our great grandparents are from Ireland, and so on the maternal side. And so, you know, I've always, you know, kind of, just because that just seemed like the most strongest cultural identity. I always, you know, as a child, and also growing up in a predominantly Irish descendant community, you know, I always strongly identified with that culture. But at the same time too, you know, you and I both on our father's side, coincidentally, not by family, have, you know, Eastern European and Jewish roots. And you were obviously raised more with your Jewish identity than I was. But, you know, also in recent years, I've come to, you know, think about that more, you know, what it means to be, you know, a Jew in the 21st century in the United States, and also what it means to be, you know, a Jew who sees the injustice that the Palestinian people face and is outraged by, you know, the occupation of, you know, Palestinian territory by, you know, our people. And so, you know, there's a lot of interesting thoughts that I've, you know, had to process with that over the years, over the recent years. But really what I think in the last, you know, I would say like 5 to 10 years of my life, you know, moving around, living in different places, meeting different people, is that I really, you know, I don't really identify with a specific culture or a specific place or a specific identity, because it's really just kind of up in the air. And so for that reason, you know, I think that's influenced a lot the way I see the world and the way I, you know, think about the United States, and the way I think about nationality in general. Because for me, I guess it just, as I get older, it just means less and less. And so it's like, well, it's like, what does it mean to be from the United States? I was like, well, I don't really know anymore. You know, we were taught in school kind of like the, you know, what does it mean to be an American? And kind of like this, like, you know, idea of like a melting pot, which is, you know, really not a great metaphor. And,
Yeah.
and also, this idea of, being from an immigrant country and from diverse backgrounds, which is, a very sanitized way of saying colonization. Um, and, and so I think that, as I'm getting older and I learn more about like the violence behind this idea of how our country is built, it's really just, I mean, I don't know, the idea of just pertaining to a national identity has lost a lot of meaning for me and in recent years. And so it's really just it's really just an interesting kind of thing that I've come to terms with over the last, since, the end of my high school and through university education and, traveling and whatnot and meeting different people that, and I think, it's something that I've had the privilege to experience through A, education, and B, travel, living in different places that, a lot of people from similar backgrounds as us the don't have the privilege or necessarily the opportunity to have these thoughts and to process this information. And so I think that it's something that it needs to be more communicated with people from similar backgrounds as us, people of, European American backgrounds, people from, middle class, upper middle class families, people from suburban, not necessarily monocultural, but definitely like, Western European suburbs where people are from England, Ireland, France, Germany, their heritage lies there. And I think Italy, and I think, this is kind of like a perspective that people in the United States need to start considering more from our background, people in our community, people from our, quote unquote identity, that because I think a lot of, people from our identity tend to have some of the most toxic opinions about, immigration, toxic opinions about, ethnic minorities in the United States, tend to have the most toxic opinions about poverty, about multiculturalism, and so, and even the ones who do have, what they think are good opinions about them, don't understand the nuance and the kind of like the history behind it. And so I think that, a lot of political issues we're seeing today, it comes from this, idea of, and it's not even just in the United States, it's happening in Europe too. It's like this idea of like a national identity and, having to protect a national identity or having to keep a national identity. And because, the reality is that we just, particularly in the United States, we don't really have a claim to that, being from Western European backgrounds, because
yeah, well, it's weird. Like, that's something that's always struck me, coming from United States. And like I said, I had this feeling from as a kid, like, I don't know what was wrong with me or not wrong with me or how it ended up that way. But I just never felt any real, like, for example, I never felt any feelings towards what was to be considered like, American national identity, like, these very obvious symbols like the flag, like the 4th of July, like all the, like, these are, like 4th of July, it's okay, it's an enjoyable day if you're at a barbecue. I always like a barbecue. Fireworks are fun, but I don't know, I always felt just a general nothingness really for these kinds of things. Same thing with these like symbols of like national identity, like standing up for the Pledge of Allegiance and all these kinds of things. Like, I innately, for some reason, and I think that this is to be like analyzed further, like why would somebody just like, what does it take for somebody to be kind of into this kind of stuff? And innately never really had like a big motivation to do that kind of stuff, like stand for the flag in school. And then the problem is in what happens to a lot of people, not a problem, but it's a good thing, is once you start reflecting on a lot of these symbols of like identity, because it's really like mostly all we have in the United States, because we don't have like a long history. We're not like people of that land, like, I mean, the farthest you could go back might be 400 years, and then I'm very skeptical of what might be in your family history. And,
Exactly. Yeah.
was it really your land, and were you really tending to that land? That's a whole deeper subject. But so it's like really, it's very much like, and this is, I understand. Like, I have good friends that are like, but generally on the same page, and like I have no problem. They get a kick out of the national anthem. Like, they get a kick out of like seeing the planes fly by and the stars and stripes and all kinds of stuff like that. And like, okay, whatever, But I never got a kick. I never got a kick out of that. And I think that a lot of people are just, they feel like stuff like that, these images, these idols, this iconography, this kind of stuff is all I don't know. It's like a phenomenon that just kind of occurred. It's almost like some really great kind of marketing that's been happening, and it continues. I mean, things like the American flag, it's on your underwear, it's on your can of Coke, it's on your license plate, it's everywhere. So, but what does it all really mean? And I don't know. I just never really felt that strong connection. And then I can remember, like, as time went on, being about, 15 years old, 16 years old, when the Iraq war started. And, I was at school, and there's, people that are like, yeah, like, this is America. And you watch the news, and it's like, this is what we do. We go out and save the world and stuff like that. And I was like, I don't feel any connection to this. Like, I do not want to be like blowing these people up. Like, and even at that young age, I wasn't even paying taxes yet, but I was like, is this what our money is going to? You know what I mean? And it really, I don't know, kind of, it was an important lesson that I learned from all that, which was like, whoa, like who am I? What is this country? Like, what are we doing here? And that just kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah, well, I think from this, I think, one of the things that, especially, European descendant Americans need well, first of all, the term American too is also like, it is extremely problematic. And as a country, we need, especially on the left, even people on the left and people who are of a progressive mindset still use this term American to describe people from the United States, which is, living obviously in South America. A lot of people here have a big, gripe with that and a big issue with that. And it's something that as a progressive community, we need to get better at not using the term American to describe people from the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
and I'm guilty of it for sure. I do my best to try to avoid it, but it's interesting in Spanish, there's a word for people from the United States, like a denominator that we don't have in English. It's like someone from Colombia is a colombiano, and someone from Mexico is a mexicana, and someone from, Cuba is a cubano, cubana, and someone from the United States is not an americano or americana. They're either, they say norteamericano, which I think is weird because what that includes,
there's like
Canada.
36 countries in North America, or in the Caribbean, and in Mexico.
Or they say estadounidense, which is like a United Statesian, basically.
Yeah.
Which we don't have that in the English vocabulary at the moment. So there definitely needs to be some sort of conversation among progressive people about how to start.
It's so funny though, because I don't know, for me, well, I can say it's funny because over here in Norway and most of the other countries I've lived in over here or been to, it's very simple. Americana. And I feel very strange saying that, because usually, I mean, I just kind of made it up on my own, but usually when I talk to people, it sounds a bit awkward, but I usually say I'm a US American, or or like, if I'm in Germany, there's a way, you can say, ich bin, Amerikanisch or whatever. Sorry, German people, if I'm saying this wrong. But I always say, like, ich komme aus den USA, like I come from the USA.
Yeah, that's what I usually say too. Yeah,
because for me it doesn't it's not like it's in by no way like correct or like intellectually honest to like say something like I'm American. It's like, dude, there's North America, there's South America, there's Central America, there's like all these Caribbean islands, and there's like 50 countries in the Americas, like
yeah,
so it's so I mean I think it's pretty easy actually if people just decided to, because even in other languages it's translated as just I'm American, and there's really nothing,
yeah.
no way
Well,
to
it's
get around
interesting
it.
that it's funny because in Spanish, which is the predominant language of the Americas, not English,
Hmm.
there's a word to describe someone from the United States. There's a denominator. And so I wonder, I don't know the linguistic history of that, but I'm sure it's related to, the fact that people from, Latin America were like, hey, we're not going to call these guys American because they're from the United States.
Yeah,
We're going to call them United Statesians. um,
yeah, well, it makes sense,
yeah.
yeah.
But I think, what, what this leads us to is, I think that there, especially coming from the European descendant community in the United States, is we need to start identifying more with a global identity rather than a national identity.
Mm.
And I think that's something that again, due to our circumstance and our privilege, we've been able to kind of psychologically and philosophically think about over the course of our adulthood and young adulthood and through education. But I think it needs to get a little more mainstream within the United States, and this conversation needs to be had more with in schools first of all, but also kind of like in the media, because I feel like even if we talk about you know even progressive quote unquote politicians, like someone like a Bernie Sanders or something like this, even Bernie was saying things that were very, in a way, nationalist when talking about economic ideas. He was like, we need to protect, US jobs. We need to protect American jobs. And I was like, well, yes, that's true. But like the way it needs to be phrased needs to start being in a more global context, especially because the United States is the biggest economy in the world. And so even this idea on the left, I think, or in the progressive community, needs to start to be a little more globalized because, the reality is that our country's kind of just a bizarre mix of other countries and colonization, and so it's really just weird to it's really, I think it's weird and also ultimately dangerous to really create this national identity which we have created and are trying to well, at least many people are trying to strengthen. um so yeah, I think for a future podcast, we can start to talk about kind of like what does it mean to be a global citizen and how does it look to be a global citizen, as someone who comes from the United States. And so I think, maybe in a future podcast, we can start to talk about that a little bit more.
All right, everybody, thanks for sticking around, and thanks to Dan for coming on the show today. Please tune in next week when we're going to have a bit more discussion about global citizenry, what it means to be a global citizen, and how to be active and proactive and engaged and involved with your local communities wherever you may be in the world, as well as your communities back home. So please tune in next week. Please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel or any of our various platforms where our podcast is available. Always feel free to send us a message. Stay in touch between episodes. Thanks again, and from the road, c'est la vie.